Bigger picture, I don't have any evidence on the rest of that picture. And I'm not making any claims of such. So I'm simply looking at estimating a basic causal parameter, like what's the relationship between the two once we hold everything else constant. And we can't really answer this question unless we move into a counterfactual world of what would District D or somewhere have been like had this not have happened. So what I say here is, does District D, which has converted much land previously used for, say, rice, into oil palms, currently have much lower poverty than it would have had it not made these policy changes. So that's accounting for the business cycle, that's accounting for all the poverty transfer programs, all of this. Once we hold everything else constant, what's left by this change in land use intensity to a potentially a higher productivity crop? So I'll note that down. So why am I interested in land and oil palm at the moment? The idea of agriculture being really pro-poor has been around for a long time. It was the focus of the World Bank's 2008 World Development Report, and a lot of people have, and the oil palm is an interesting area because it's very labour intensive, it's relatively low skill, and it's a really high yielding cash crop. So compared to other types of agriculture, in theory, you would expect it to be quite pro-poor. But the magnitudes are quite important. We know that this is an area where it's been associated with a lot of deforestation, with a lot of social problems, with a lot of other stuff, and it's important that we can put some numbers and some evidence to what the incentives are that are shaping all of this stuff in certain areas. In particular, I'm quite interested to try and do some numerical calculations to find out, do these economic benefits in certain places exceed the environmental costs, which mean that the current prices that we're placing on things like community-based payments for ecosystem service things, RED+, they might be well.
Other things. So, to my knowledge, the characteristic of district is different for different region. And then, so how do you isolate these other activities other than palm oil? Thank you.
Next, another guys, left hand side. Progressive. Okay.
I have a question. So when I look at, my name is Izari. I'm from EY. I have a question. When I look at your research and you gave the finding that poverty decreases, my question is, I think it could be an assumption of gentrification, movement of people outside of the area that reduces the poverty rate. How do you explain that effect within your empirical data? Thank you.
Okay. Sir, please.
Saya Diana Pitupulu dari Fakultas Ekonomi UI. Ryan, what was the source of your land cover data? Is it from satellite data or statistics?
Are you talking about the land use for oil palm represented in the main results, or land cover that I referred to in there?
Source of expansion.
True crop statistics in Indonesia, Department of Agriculture.
Yeah. Because some of the statistics are not reliable. Why didn't you use the satellite data?
It's much more endogenous. The satellite data will pick up actuals, but you can't distinguish. So what I've done in some instrument, I use that stuff as an instrument. So under the idea that initial forest stocks and all those things might partial out certain types of expansion, and the deforestation and tree cut affects everything. So they're not valid instruments to start with. So I've pulled that out from the paper, and I'm probably going to hide that. But in terms of using that at the moment, all the stuff that's available through Landsat and through elsewhere, nothing that is public can tell the difference between a mature plantation and a forest. And so it's tree cover. So that would be a different question. I would be looking at forest change, which is an interesting topic as well, how that relates to it. But it would be hard. You could only really do the panel analysis, and I don't think I could rely on identification coming through, say, administrative lags and through the biological lag, which is what I'm trying to do here. So the nature of the data being official potentially means that there might be some administrative lags between the decisions, which I can kind of exploit and focus on for going to causality. But yeah, I have access to that. And I mean, there's potentially some interesting stuff coming on in the next year or so that has satellite plantation data at a much more granular level, but nothing available at the moment does that. It's only tree cover. And the stuff that's there is official data. So when you go to the Global Forest Watch and you look at their satellite data of where the plantations are and those ones, that's just the stuff from the Department of Agriculture. It's the same thing at the moment, yeah.
Because what I'm thinking of is that...
Sorry, can you just ask this?
Because if households which previously relied on forests for their consumption now rely on non-forest land, of course they will move to consumption of market goods.
Yep.
So they'll have to consume this list of items that's in seasonals. Because previously, they didn't pay for it, they just get it from the resource. So it looks as if poverty is reduced, but it's actually switching of consumption, which previously they harvested, and now they have to buy into the market. I don't know. But it might be an interesting thing to look at the household level, how the composition of consumption has changed over the years.
No, I think that's a great comment. I'll go to the other. Well, one thing we're also looking at is nutrition. So yeah, whether nutritional intake
The nutrition
as well,
content,
which is kind of related to what
similar if you try to change, but it's basically from free goods to now they go into the market.
Yeah.
It's a basket of goods.
I was going to look at multidimensional poverty and those other ones, but a lot of those things don't change quickly. A lot of the things that go into that
What
index.
would be nice is to find some districts which have known conversion from forest to plantation and compare it to districts which has known conversion from non-forest to plantation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll do it. So still to the other two questions. Thank you very much. So Trian? Yeah. I can't isolate those other activities. I'm assuming that they're more or less randomly distributed or correlated to the employment shares and those other things and being picked up. I think the Tottenham story is really interesting as well. I understand in the last few years there's been a bit of a Tottenham boom, but I haven't included that yet. I'm not too sure on how to, apart from maybe just including sectoral shares and those levels of production as well. So I might do that, yeah, I'll include them as controls for now. Thank you. And Sadi? Yeah, good. At the district level, it's still pretty aggregate. I'm not worried about people moving out of districts. I'm more worried about people moving into districts. So we're going to do uselessness and only take people that have been there for more than 5 years. And so look at basically permanent resident impacts. But moving within districts, we'll be picking up because we're dealing with the district aggregate, because it's a district poverty rate, so that shouldn't affect it too much. But yeah, that's a really interesting story. We could get at that with using maybe like census and much lower level of data, which would be interesting. I'm not sure how I could deal with it here, and I think it's buried within the nature of being at the district level.
The possibility of movement within Ireland, is that persist?
Yeah, maybe, yeah. So yeah, I think by only focusing on permanent residents is one way I could deal with that. Otherwise, including like maybe initial conditions from the subas and stuff on migration data there. But I'm not sure how I would identify that one. Yeah, I'm all open to comments there. That's probably going on for sure. We know that migration is quite big and people have been moving. Thank you.
Okay. We have more time, and then probably open the second session. Ms. Asia, another case, and another group. Oh, okay. Good.
Thank you, Edward, for your excellent presentation. My question is very simple, probably. Just go to the page 36. From the its statistic, I think the result is the impact of the land use on the palm oil is it's mixed. I mean, so some is positive and some is negative. In here, but why is the opens in Sulawesi, the impact is very higher compared with Sumatra and Kalimantan, as you also present that most product of the palm oil in Sumatra and Kalimantan, and also when the result in Java is positive. So my question is, what the main reason about this result, and what your recommendation about this one, especially for Java, because if the impact is positive, so we have to try to get something like this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, the second. Okay. You become the
I can
second.
do that one.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm Sonny Mombunan, the University of Indonesia Research Center for Climate Change. I have a question to clarify, and it relates to instrumental variable. Would you mind explain further why deforestation from the time frame 2000 to 2005 is a weak instrumental variable? And then the empirical finding shows that since the initial forest stocks seems to be quite significant, or very significant if you look at the findings, and yeah, it's just further clarification. I'll do it first.
Yeah, no worries.
Sorry, the third. Okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Bisuk. I don't have questions, but I have several comments. The first one is why you choose the area of palm oil land, because if we are talking about poverty, so we are talking about people. Why could you think that the area, as the area grows larger and larger, it could brings lower level of poverty? I don't know, I haven't read the complete version of your paper, but if you stand by this stance, I think you should put the profile of productivity in each province. For example, you can provide that, okay, all palm plantations in Kalimantan, Sulawesi is becoming more labor intensive than before. So if you could put that point of view in your paper, it will be, I think your argument will be legit. And then the second one, it is just my opinion. Your result is quite controversial because it will be not being on the same way with environmental goal of this country. I went to Kalimantan and Papua a few years ago, and then they are facing challenges. Majority of their forests are, what can I say, hutan lindung. I don't know the reservation forest. And then based on its functions, they could not converse its functions. However, there are so many investors who want to open oil palm plantations in Kalimantan, to be precise, in the province of North Kalimantan, and also in the province of West Papua, in Kabupaten, in the district of Wasio. There are so many investors who want to plant oil palm plantations. Yeah, if according to your study, it will be a legitimation for the local government. Okay, it's minus in Kalimantan and Papua, so just converse it rather than our people is keep poor and so on and so on. So I think, I don't know, it's just like a little bit controversial for me. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll work backwards through them. Yeah, I completely agree. I've been trying to emphasize that the environmental and economic trade-off seems huge. And I'm also agnostic to where it's coming from. A lot of, some of it hasn't come from deforested land, some of it's come from switching from degraded, and I feel that that's where the policy needs to go. They can't get deforested, that's just the way it is. With climate change, that's the easiest way to meet emissions targets and everything. Yeah, so I'm on the same page with that. In terms of, that's one stuff, investors, I'm on your page, I don't disagree there. In terms of productivity, I think, I can definitely include it. One land area, it's not necessarily land area, it's normally, it is, but it's more share. I'm more thinking of how much is each district posting, so it's trying to pick up kind of the intensity and like the land use structure is what I was trying to get at. I did just have hectares and Ks in there, but all the different sizes, and so I changed it from just being size. So I'm trying to pick up kind of the economic equivalent, no, the land equivalent of structural change in an economy, but with land use patterns. So that's what I was trying to pick up.
But I think it's better for you to put the profile of plantations productivity. I mean, if you could prove that more labor, oil palm plantations absorb more labor from year to year, I think your argument is legitimate. Okay, these plantations provide more employment, and we know that the only way to reduce poverty is create employment. So I think it's legitimate. But if the profile of productivity in palm oil plantations become more capital intensive as the years going on, I think it is a bit questionable. How could machine make people richer? Who is getting richer and who is getting poorer?
Exactly. I've only got the short-term one, and the long-term one I think is less reliable. But I definitely agree. I need to include productivity, and I haven't tested employment yet. Okay. I said at the end that I want to look at supplements. So we think that there's not many other channels that it can be in theory. So I need to test that. If that's not there, then that's what's left. Solomon, thank you for your questions. Thanks for going all the way through the slides to the part that I wasn't trying to show, to the IVs. I didn't present them because, as we know, for instruments to be valid, they need to be relevant, so quite predictive and strong, but also orthogonal, so that they can't affect, in this case, it can't affect poverty in any other way apart from through land use patterns. So deforestation affects poverty in lots of ways apart from through land use patterns. So its exclusion restriction we know is violated. Same goes for forest cover at the start. So both of those I know are invalid instruments, but I was only using them to get at the partial effects and for sensitivity. So you'll see in the final column, whenever I do the GMM with all of them, they both disappear and the result becomes garbage. Mostly because IVs are really, really sensitive, and so I prefer the long difference in that regard. Why is the deforestation one weak? I have no idea. A lot of instruments are weak. It's really hard to find a good one. I thought it would be strong, but it could be to do with the nature of the data. It's the pixelated Hansen data, which you might be familiar with from the Burgess paper. I use that, and so I'm not sure why, but it wasn't good. And when you have a weak instrument or a bad instrument, we tend to just throw them out and try to find another one. So that's why I put that away now. And I think it's also that partial effect is interesting. We do want to really know what the conditional effect of land use change conditional on deforestation. I think that's a hugely interesting and important question, but you can't get it using this approach, at least not now. Well, I couldn't. Not in a reliable way. I wouldn't be comfortable with that result because I know that the exclusion restriction is so badly violated and the instrument's too weak. Like, for it to be good, you need to be over the Stock-Yogo test of around 18, whereas the F in that case I think was around 7, so it falls far short of what I needed. That's why they were weak, and that's why I haven't included them as being a focus. Is that okay? Yeah.
Very short, getting to that point. Just a speculation. Maybe it is because the poverty is a consumption-based poverty, right? That's the one that you use. And there has been, discussion on using, say, ecosystem-based. The issue is the data. This is very, not longitudinal research, and that might explain why it's strongly related with forest stock, but maybe doesn't appear in your research because again the data. Yeah. But just a speculation.
It's the first stage though. It's the relationship between the land and the forest that's really weak. It's not the second stage.
Okay.
So that's why it was a surprise. The dependent variable shouldn't too much affect the instrument strength. It will affect the exclusion restriction, but it shouldn't affect the first stage. And so it's still weak. But it's definitely a sensitivity indicator. The instruments tend to get stronger when you drop all your right-hand side variables and have less in there, less excluded instruments in the estimation. So I did that as well. Didn't improve enough to make it worth commenting on. But I think I need to include initial conditions and other things for it to be reliable. I couldn't just present an RV result that had nothing else controlled for on the right-hand side and a long-run estimate. That would be a bit misleading. And last, so we're talking about this result. There isn't a positive impact in Java. That's certainly not what's on that graph. It's completely insignificant. That confidence interval is huge. So if it was significant, we would need to see it doing this one. This guy would have to be here. But it's not. There's absolutely nothing there in that result. And this one here is being driven by outliers. So there's a few districts that have come on. So it's like the Real story where there's a few really rich districts that are slicing that result downwards. And convergence. They were initially poorer, so they're converging to where the other guys were. And as far as policy recommendations go, I absolutely don't have any. I think we need to consider the whole story more holistically. I think this is an important part of it. We need to know, like we can't do the rest of it without accounting for the poverty dynamics and knowing what's going on at the bottom of the distribution, because a lot of the legal activity and stuff is difficult to regulate, where the problems are now in terms of the deforestation are coming from the most vulnerable, and these are the incentives that they're facing. So it's important to incorporate that in. But as far as policy changes, I don't have any evidence to go any further than that. I've only got what the effect appears to be on the district aggregate poverty rates. So yeah, I'm not comfortable extrapolating to wild policy recommendations from what a narrow set of results on one parameter that I've got here. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. Probably you have a third session if you have another. Okay, one. Next. Two. Again. Okay. Okay. Three. Okay. Please. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Sri from UPS. I just want to give you some comments. I regarding what Ms. Anadi for stated that currently Thank you. My name is Sri from UPS. I just want to give you some comments. Convey useful for you to enrich and make your data reliable. Regarding your 4 pits, it's mentioned that converted much land previously used for rice into oil and currently have lower poverty. That's regarding the recent agriculture census in BPS. That mostly Indonesian people, that agriculture is one of such kind of security for people who can have a job. Even that sector actually in the some payment condition work for them. So regarding this poverty reduction, we cannot say it can be as a poor poverty.
This is a nice infographic from the bank. The only point I'm trying to make here is that most of the people that are living in poverty live in Java, but the poverty rates in the regions are far higher, as you all probably know. So the spatial aspect is important, and that's important for interpreting the findings and for making policy. So the rates are much higher out there, but the actual numbers are far lower. So in terms of the rest of the data, what I'm actually estimating, the explanatory variable is the composition, so the share, the structure, the amount of land in a given district that is being used for oil palm crops. It's official data taken from the tree crop stats of Indonesia, downloaded straight from the World Bank's website. So it's officially measured as oil palm land. I put in here counterfactually satellite data because there's a lot of stuff that goes on informally, and there may be some discrepancies between what's officially reported and areas. that you might pick up in the satellite, such as through the Global Forest Watch and these other initiatives that are going on. Yeah. So I denominate by district size for consistency, because if we just use levels and you have some big districts, some small districts, it wouldn't really make much sense. Other studies have not bothered to lag it. I think this is important because tree crop stats are measured at the end of the year. Sustenance stats measured in the end of the year, the middle of the year. So if we were to not lag, it basically raises issues with the timing of the effect, of how long we're assuming it will take for a changing one thing to affect the other. This is what I pick up with the other studies. They find really mixed results and they jump all over the shop. And I would largely put this down to an effect misspecification, or just an unspecification, really, if we use a better word. And I code the non-palm areas as 0 because I think it's important to keep a control group, to keep those areas that don't do it, or that move from not having any more palmland into it, because there has been a lot of that. Whereas in previous studies they've only focused on within areas, and that variation has been very small, and in terms of statistical power you're not going to pick up much anyway, no matter how you do it. So to maximise the ability that if there is anything there that we detect it, I think this is the most kind of clean and straightforward approach to do that. Why land? Why did I go to land? I've done all this for production as well, and the results are more or less similar, but they diverge a lot in terms of the heterogeneity, in terms of the different sectors. But I was told to come back to land by my supervisor, Woody, because it's basically the reduced form. It's the precondition for the sector to exist. It's the only factor of production that is fixed. The opportunity cost is huge. It's a central policy issue. It's much cleaner to work with to begin with. We don't actually know. And John McCarthy from ANU also told me the exact same thing. He said, you should really just tell us the simple question of whether areas that have more farmland have lower poverty rates or not. And I said, okay, I'll try and do that, and I'll try and control for other things as well, because doing that would be a bit biased. So that's how I got to land. And so I thought I'm trying to establish a general stylized facts, and all the other heterogeneity, all the other nuances should be contained within this really crude and reduced form relationship, presumably. Because once the land changes, then production changes, and different people come in, and everything else happens in between here. And so it's more exogenous. The other benefit for the purposes of econometrics is that it's much more exogenous than production and yields and all these other things. And so it's highly unlikely that this future poverty rates and things that go on in the district level can affect things that happened before it in terms of official land use changes reported in the Department of Agriculture. It's highly unlikely. So I basically argue for a conditional exogeneity identification assumption here, which, I've tried other approaches like instrumental variables, and most of the instruments are quite garbage. So I'm focusing on this to start with. So thoughts on that, on the identification as well, for those that are interested in that stuff, would be really useful. This is what the expansion looks like over the last, not the last 10 years, the 10 years from 2000 to 2010. As we've seen, land has increased quite a bit. Productivity boomed from around 2005, but that could have been the planting early, because it takes about 5 years to mature. So it's increased substantially. We go from 5% up to 15 over the same period. 5 million up to 15, and production has skyrocketed. And if we look at production in value terms, so this is from the Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity, which Ricardo Hausman and people work on. This looks even more ridiculous. So this is in dollar terms because of the boom in CPO price. It's a 16-fold increase from what it was at the start. So it's huge for the economy, and the linkages to emerging China and India as well are huge. Like those big ones there are in Southeast Asia. They're the main buyer. So highly engaged in the region. This is what the explanatory variable looks like spatially. I've chopped it down so you can read it a bit better and remove the eastern islands. But yeah, so there's a lot of variation. They are kind of clustered, but yeah, at the district level we should be able to pick up this, I think. So this is what I'm really exploiting, this kind of spatial dimension, and then how this map has changed over time. And you can look at this at the global forest watch. But the oil palm picture is static, I think, from around 2008 or 10, which is in between my panel, so useful for the purpose of analysis. The black dots are all the mills, all the refineries as well. Really, really cool data set and really cool tool. So those that haven't looked at us, yeah, it's quite useful to have to explore. Some simple summary statistics, as is common to present in presentations. The only two things I would highlight over here, you can read them yourselves, is that the poverty rate has compressed over time and fallen. So the level has fallen and the distribution has narrowed, whereas oil palm land share has done the opposite. The composition has widely increased in variability and the level has increased. So the two things are going in the opposite direction and we're exploiting that. So if the left-hand side variable is becoming more compressed up and the right-hand side not, I think we have to be really careful about how we specify it to detect anything, because it is, probably is being reduced by a lot of other policies. And time-varying emitted factors that affect both land use and poverty dynamics, or no district-specific poverty programs whose placement directly or indirectly changes in official land use, or factors that shift the parallel trends. Because it's in effect a difference in difference model, it means that we're basically assuming parallel trends, conditional, and all this stuff. And so if there's other things that come in and shift the trends, then it'll be very problematic. So why do I think that this is a remotely plausible assumption? I don't think that what happens in future poverty can be is really anticipated, at least the short-term fluctuations. So I think that the lag is quite nice in that regard, and that any time-varying district-varying observables will be highly muted by the controls and by the island years. But we can also deal with the other things. The first one was a basic placebo test, where we do future values to make sure that there's nothing there and there's not something else driving it, such as long-term trends. And spatially randomizing all the land data as well gives a really similar result, just in the random Excel function of random. I also use district-specific trends and initial conditions interactions to relate to confounding trends that might be related to the initial conditions. And the coefficients are remarkably stable to basically any other controls that I pull out of that bank database. But this will probably come up. I haven't put in the DAO and DAO paths yet. I didn't even think to do that. I did total government spending at a district level, but I need to include those ones in. So they're two important ones that I haven't put in yet. So the estimation techniques that I do use, first, just to keep in line with some of the existing working papers and preliminary analysis on the topic, I use first difference. I don't really necessarily like this one too much because this focuses on the variation between 1 year of a district, and we assume that the time to effect is known and that is no more than 1 year. And given that this is supposed to measure middle of the year and it's on the end, it basically assumes 6 months until the effects happen in average. So if one of them is 1 year, one of them is not at all at the start, it means the mean effect has to be 6 months, which is quite unreasonable. You wouldn't really expect the effects to take place that quickly. And that's something that came up yesterday when I was also showing the results. So I also use the mean difference fixed effects estimator, which kind of also picks up level effects and those changes within a given district over the entire sample period. And it's much less restricted than just using a first difference. And a more kind of fancy, computationally intensive one, the FGLS, which I use district dummies for manually. It's weighted, so it's way more efficient. And we might expect some path dependence, so you can do some fancy kind of error correction mechanism, like procedures on here as well. So I do all three, because I thought it was nice to show everything and then get feedback before I settle on one. So, cut to the chase. That's what I do, how I do it. This is what's been basically the main result yields from those regressions that I've shown before. The full stops have all turned into commas. They're supposed to be full stops. So basically, as we see here, the first difference is statistically significant from 0, but only just. And that's what the previous studies have done, and they didn't really find much. But if we allow a bit more time, more than 6 months, the effect becomes pretty unambiguous. And so if we take the 0.7 as 0.007, the way that's interpreted is that a 10% increase in oil palm land share basically corresponds to a 7% reduction in the poverty rate itself. FGLS is more precise, it's much smaller, it's around 2%, but it's still significant because poverty reduction has slowed in this decade to the previous one, hasn't been as quick, there's been a lot of other stuff going on. Once we control for that, this is what's left. It's still quite significant, I think. And so when interpreting it, I've so far been just taking the mean between these two guys because it's the coefficient, the magnitude is quite significant. No, not significant. No, it's okay. Yeah, thanks. the magnitude's quite sensitive to estimation techniques and how you do it. So I think the most transparent way is to basically present everything and then get feedback accordingly. This is what it looks like in table form. For those that are more table inclined, as I mentioned, the sample size is fine. It's over 3,000 and 341 parent districts. I haven't dropped all the districts in Jakarta from here, which was suggested to me to do, and I'll do that shortly as well. Yeah. So that's the previous one in table form. Those results that I've just shown are similar no matter what I do. This list here is just going to keep growing with feedback, so please help me make it longer. Basically, I've done heaps of controls, lots of initial conditions-based trends, district-specific trends, different district boundaries, no control groups, so just within oil palm districts, different estimation techniques, non-logs, and log oil palm, and different outcomes such as HDI or mean household expenditure at the bottom 20%. And also at the provincial level, if I use province data, I get the exact same thing. So that general poverty relationship to me seems relatively robust. But what about the regions? What about when we start breaking it down by islands? I did the exact same thing using subsamples and interactions, so doing it separately. This is what I got for subsamples using the baseline kind of district year, island year model that I showed before. As you'd expect, there's nothing in Java. The confidence interval there is huge. These two are basically exactly the same as the previous result at around 0.007. The Sulawesi one is large, but I think that's more a matter of convergence. Because the poverty rates there were higher at the start of the period, and there's actually not that many areas to produce. So that's largely driven by outliers, at least from speaking to a few people so far. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there's bigger effects in one place than the other. It's more in nature of what's actually going on in the context of the data with convergence and other factors. I think so. Yeah, more or less it seems consistent across regions, and when we use interactions, they basically give the same result as the subsamples as well. So this is the result using interaction terms. If we add this one, we don't worry about. It's not significant. If we add this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one, and this one, we basically get to the same place as we did in the main result. So it appears to be quite consistent across the country. So people are probably thinking, why are we worried about the really, really short run? We probably need to care more about what happens in medium or long-term effects. And I couldn't agree more. But panel data is nice, and for purposes of getting into my thesis, it's much stronger. Why I want to go to the long run is simply because we don't identify the full effects in an annual panel in the short run. By using the within dimension, you're omitting heaps of important factors, such as the time that it takes to switch activities, the biological lags until yields and profitability, the changing livelihood strategies which imply transaction costs, a non-linear response perhaps, and changes in the main effects which are likely to come from the changes in the main result that I've shown so far, I think are therefore likely to come from kind of level effects or channels other than the production and sale of the crop, such as the labour, such as starting up plantations, those type of things. I'm not convinced that what I've shown so far can actually come from production and sale. I don't think it's possible in terms of time. And so we need a different approach. We need several different approaches. So, this is meant to be a stagger slide. Okay, so I've got two long-term approaches that I use. I'm all ears for some more and some better ones. Basically, the first way to do it would be to extend the panel width. So the year between the years. And so it's the same identification assumption, but basically, yeah, 2, 3, 4 yearly panels. So I don't need to go through that because I've spent a lot of time trying to do that so far. And the other approach is to take the start and the end and basically just do a long difference between the two periods and then look at what happens over that one. By doing that, we also, in effect, apply we also get rid of the time invariant things that bring the benefit of the district mix effects, but we don't really get any of the time varying ones as well. So, the long difference is a bit less robust than a frequent panel. And I include initial controls so that areas can have different types of poverty trends based on where they are. So the results from a wider panel, allowing more time to affect, more or less line up behind the start ones, but they grow over time. Not really grow. If we just look at the fixed effect one, so this guy and this guy, the confidence intervals are largely overlapping the whole way through. So I don't think it grows too much, but the magnitude is sensitive to which data you pick up. Yeah, I think that's quite important. So I need to think how to really frame it in the end in the most transparent way, because it is, people will rerun it and say, I've got this different number, I've got this different number. But I've done it every way I can, and the signs don't change. The signs are consistently negative, but they do change in magnitude, they do change in precision whenever we use things like FGLS, but more or less the direction seems to stay the same. And the time to effect of the land change, to me, appears to be around the 3-year mark, 3-4 year mark. The long difference result as well. I've just presented the simple one, not the one that has chocolate, because they stay the same. So this is basically the long difference result, including initial and difference log real district regional GDP, and the initial poverty rates. And we've done other ones. It's very robust, also including district deforestation, economic growth, and more, which parcels out those effects. Which you also expect to kind of be channels and to move in different directions, so it's really tricky. But the way that would be interpreted would be that over the entire period, say a 10% increase in land use from say 10% to 20% would correspond to a 12% reduction in the poverty rate. So that's how that would be interpreted. And yeah, the areas again, which are robust for their specificity. As always, that's why it says holes instead of OLS. So in summary, it's basically, the abstract more or less is that it's different types of all-time land expansions are really likely to have different types of effects on poverty and the rate of poverty reduction. I haven't gone into that here. The mean poverty impact across all types of land, all types of sectors, all types of ownership and regions, so far to me appear to be positive. No matter which way I cut this up. And the mean impact though varies over time, so there's a dynamic to it which I'd like to understand a bit more. I'm not sure how to do that using these techniques though. And the magnitude is indeed sensitive to the approach that I use. I have not provided any evidence on dimensions of development other than consumption-based poverty, any relationships outside the reduced form, or effects on the rest of the population, on other sectors of the economy, or on heterogeneity within this reduced form, say relating to plantation size, ownership, source, all those type of things. So yeah, if oil palm is driving deforestation, the environmental and economic trade-off appears to be quite significant when it comes to real poverty. And I think for policy to be really effective, it needs to account for these incentives. Otherwise, this is skeptics will be getting the prices wrong in economic terms. Next steps for this paper. This is a new slide that I've incorporated feedback from my visit so far onto, so hopefully it can grow a lot more. Thanks to you guys. I'd like to estimate the effects of 1.5 times the poverty line to look at effects on vulnerability, and also P1 and P2, so poverty gap, or P2 and P3. I'm not sure which one's which. The poverty gap and the poverty severity indexes, which tell you more what's going on within that bottom decile. And I did this morning actually. The long difference approach tends to be quite sensitive to your start and your finishing years. So I did it using 2002, 2008, and same. It was basically the same. Didn't change, so that's okay. I need to download and include the conflict data and the DAU and DACA. I need to now test the employment channel. Like these results suggest that the effect has to be coming through employment if it's a short-term one, and not production. So if that's what that result suggests, then the next reasonable step I think is to go over to Sakenas and see what's happening to agricultural employment in these districts, and to actually test that theory. And if it doesn't, then then who knows what's going on? Yeah, the results will be garbage. Hopefully not. But then I want to basically go to the household level as well. So look at the effects on the rest of the population by using the migration data, finding people who have been in the district for more than 5 years in Susanas, and only looking at that subsample, and only looking at forest communities and looking at those ones. So do that type of thing with Susanas would be nice, and to do it by quintile. So far, I have looked at effects on the mean and on the bottom 20%, and there's absolutely nothing at the mean. And on the bottom 20%, it's much less strong than this. It's still significant on the bottom 20%, but it appears to me to be petering off as you start to move up the income distribution. So I need to unpack that a bit more. And yeah, and certainly I want to go into some heterogeneity. So look at basically different opportunity costs whenever we go from, say, degrading land, agriculture, all those types of ones. So different types of expansion and different types of sizes and ownership. I'm expecting that the forest ones and the peatland ones, things like that, will have opposite results to this potentially. And yeah, different sizes and ownership. I have those results, but I haven't put them here. Yeah, and so that's the next steps. I've also got a paper on the production and value side of things, which is really rough, but I thought I'd start with this one first. And the main question I want to try and answer with that is, how does income from CPO compare to different types of income, whenever it comes to poverty reduction, when it comes to, say, the health and education and social development elasticities of different types of income? Because in my first paper I showed that basically mining and agriculture has the lowest social development elasticities compared to modern sectors such as industry, services, other types of things. And I basically want to test that here. Just because we get a positive effect doesn't mean that that's positive relative to, say, other sectors of the economy. And so we really need to have an actual policy interpretation. We need to put that into that context, I think, for it to be more useful. Yeah. And I also can look at how the recent CPO price fluctuation changes have affected this. So really short-run stuff in terms of the shocks. I've used this exact same approach to look at human capital as well. I haven't written up the results, I've only got the code and the tables. But there's an interesting story going on there. I find that secondary enrolments are much lower in districts that have had all-time land expansions. And the test scores are also lower, but over a long-term time horizon. Which makes, you wouldn't expect the test score impacts to be quick. And you would expect the participation ones to be more short-term. So it suggests that the human capital story is not quite so rosy as the poverty one at all. So I think that's more interesting. I want to look at that next. Yeah, and then also the macro parts. So bringing it back to the broader literature on, can increasing agricultural productivity have forward linkages and drive economic development, or does it actually do the opposite by incentivising the primary sector rather than the secondary and tertiary sectors? And productivity. So I would love to somehow get the access to the 2013 agricultural census, and we've got some farm level surveys that I'm working with some people on. Basically to tie the story up and say, alright, let's hold land constant, how do we keep increasing production if we can see some positive income and poverty effects in these areas. So that's kind of how I want to tie it up. And the thesis will probably end at the human capital story. There's too much there for a thesis. But yeah, I'm interested in those other two as well. These are the people that I'm quite in debt to. Paul Burke on the left-hand side is the chair of my panel. You guys are probably familiar from last month's FKP seminar. He was just recently out. Budi Reza Sudarmo is over at Harvard at the moment. He's kind of my Indonesia expert on my panel. And Robert Sparrow on the right-hand side. So these are my advisors. I'm based within an important department, and the Indonesian project has kindly funded my trip over to visit and to understand it a little bit better. And I'm being kindly hosted by WWF as well. So thank you so much to them. And that's everything. Terima kasih.